They knew. Not suspected, not feared. They knew. Long before the first boot hit the ground, before the engines warmed, before the men joked, smoked, or wrote their final letters, they knew this mission was a massacre, but the order was given anyway. War is often remembered through victories, parades, medals, speeches carved in stone. What history prefers to forget are the missions designed to fail. Operations launched not with hope, but with calculation. Where death was not a possibility, it was the expectation, and the men chosen for those missions were rarely told the truth. The illusion of choice. In every army, obedience is survival. Orders are followed because questioning them can mean prison or worse. So when the briefing officer stood at the front of the room, pointer tapping against a map, voice steady and rehearsed, the men listened. They were told the objective was difficult. They were told casualties were possible. They were told the mission was necessary. What they were not told was that command had already written them off. The map never lies, but men do. Maps don't feel guilt. Red lines drawn across enemy territory. Black arrows pointing directly into fortified hell. Behind those markings were machine gun nests, artillery positions, minefields, air superiority, all clearly visible to high command. The intelligence reports were there. The aerial photographs were clear. The probability assessments were brutal. Success, unlikely. Losses, catastrophic. And yet the operation moved forward. Why? Because sometimes in war, losing men is cheaper than changing plans. Disposable units. Not all soldiers are treated equally. Some units are elite, protected, reinforced, remembered. Others are expendable, newly formed battalions, colonial troops, convicts, conscripts, men without political value. They were sent first. They were sent fast. And they were sent knowing reinforcements would not come. If they broke through, victory. If they died, acceptable losses. Hold the line radio transmissions would later reveal the truth. When soldiers called for artillery support, they were told to hold position. When medics requested evacuation quarters, command delayed. When officers reported overwhelming resistance, headquarters went silent. The men on the ground began to realize something was wrong. This wasn't bad luck. This was design. The first wave. The first wave always suffers the most. Boats opening under machine gun fire. Aircraft flying into flat corridors already charted. Infantry advancing across open ground with no armor support. Men fell within seconds. Others froze, not from fear, but from disbelief. They had trained for war. They had not trained for slaughter. Letters that would never be read. Some had written home the night before. Short notes, jokes, promises, letters that would arrive weeks later, stamped with dates that no longer mattered. In those moments before the attack, many sensed it. That quiet feeling, that tightening in the chest, the feeling that you are being sent somewhere no one expects you to return from. Silence from above. As casualties mounted, the sky remained empty. No air cover, no supply drops, no extraction. Command watched from a distance, through reports, through numbers, through statistics. Men were no longer names. They were figures on a loss chart. The truth comes too late, survivors would later testify. They spoke of abandoned positions, of orders that made no tactical sense, of being pushed forward even as entire platoons vanished. One soldier put it simply, "We weren't meant to win. We were meant to die buying time." And time was all they ever were. By the second hour, the lie was impossible to ignore. The plan wasn't unraveling. It was unfolding exactly as intended. The ground that offered no cover. The terrain alone should have stopped the operation. Open fields, narrow valleys, frozen rivers, urban streets turned into firing corridors. Every step forward stripped the soldiers of cover. Every advance made retreat harder. Enemy gunners didn't have to hunt targets. The targets came to them. Pre-registered death artillery shells began landing before the troops even reached the objective. Not random fire, not panic shooting. These positions were pre-registered. The enemy knew the coordinates because command had marched the men straight into them. Rounds fell with mechanical precision. Explosions walked methodically across the formation. This wasn't resistance. This was execution by calculation. Radios filled with screams. The radio channels turned into chaos. Broken transmissions, shouted grid references, medics yelling for stretchers that didn't exist. One by one, unit call signs went silent. Not because communication failed, but because no one was left to speak. Officers who knew better. Some officers saw it before the first shot was fired. They read the maps. They understood the terrain. They recognized the enemy's advantage. A few requested delays. Others asked for alternate routes. All were denied. The mission clock was already running. Advance anyway. When casualties reached unsustainable levels, the response from command was brief. Advance anyway. No additional support. No tactical adjustment. No extraction window. Just advance. Men stepped over bodies they recognized. Friends, instructors, neighbors from the same hometown. The ground became slick, the air thick with smoke and iron. Collapse of discipline training can only hold for so long. Eventually, survival overrides orders. Some soldiers froze, some broke and ran, only to be cut down from behind. Others advanced in silence, already detached from the outcome. This is the moment discipline collapses. Not because of cowardice, but because the mind refuses to participate in its own destruction. Medical units, overwhelmed field medics worked until their hands shook. Morphine ran out. Bandages became rags. Stretcher bearers dropped alongside the wounded they carried. There were no evacuation routes. The wounded weren't meant to survive. They were collateral within collateral. A question no one answered across the battlefield. The same question formed in different languages, accents, and voices. Why are we still here? No one answered, because the answer was unbearable. Command already moved on. Behind the lines, headquarters had shifted focus. New objectives, revised maps, fresh units being prepared. The massacre was already being archived. Losses were being rounded. Reports were being sanitized. What was happening on the ground was no longer relevant. Nightfall didn't bring relief. Darkness didn't stop the killing. Flares turned night into daylight. Snipers hunted movement. Wounded men cried out and learned quickly that sound invited death. Some soldiers lay still for hours, pretending to be dead. Many succeeded, many didn't. Survivors by accident. Those who lived did so by chance. A shell that landed inches away. A bullet that hit bone instead of heart. A moment of hesitation that delayed a step. There was no heroism in survival, only randomness. The line finally breaks. At some point, the advance stopped. Not because command ordered it, but because there was nothing left to advance with. Entire units ceased to exist. Maps would later mark the line as held. The men who held it were buried beneath it. While men were dying in the mud, the decision that sealed their fate had already been made. Far from the battlefield, it wasn't made under fire. It wasn't made in panic. It wasn't made in confusion. It was made calmly, deliberately, in a room where no one was in danger. The room where death became strategy, polished tables, clean uniforms, maps without blood. This is where wars are truly fought. High command studied charts showing expected losses, not as warnings, but as acceptable costs. One document would later surface with a phrase underlined in red. Projected casualties, severe but manageable. Manageable. By people who would never hear the screams. Numbers that replaced faces. In that room, soldiers stopped being human. They became ratios, percentages, operational margins. A battalion reduced by half was still considered functional. A regiment destroyed was labeled delayed. The word massacre never appeared, because once you name it, you own it. Political pressure from above. The mission wasn't about victory, it was about timing. Allies needed proof of commitment. Politicians needed momentum. Newspapers needed a headline. Delaying the operation would signal weakness. Canceling it would invite questions. So the mission went forward, not because it made sense, but because it looked necessary. A sacrifice already accepted. One officer raised concerns. He pointed at the terrain, the enemy positions, the casualty estimates. The room fell quiet. Then someone spoke the truth, carefully worded, officially recorded, and later denied. Losses are unfortunate, but this operation cannot be postponed. That was it. The sacrifice had been approved. Orders sanitized for the front. By the time instructions reached the field, they had been softened. No mention of casualty projections. No acknowledgement of overwhelming resistance, just phrases like, press the attack. Hold at all costs, no withdrawal authorized. The men weren't lied to directly, they were simply denied the truth. The commanders who slept that night, senior officers slept in dry quarters. They wrote reports. They drank coffee. They discussed tomorrow's objectives. Outside, men froze, bled, and waited for orders that would never change. War had always been unequal, but tonight it was obscene. When reports came in by morning, casualty figures flooded headquarters. Entire units wiped out. Officers killed. Objectives unmet. No one was surprised. This was not a shock. It was confirmation. The quiet relief. Some commanders felt relief. The worst part was over. The operation could now be declared inconclusive or strategically valuable despite losses. The men had done their job, even if they hadn't known what that job truly was. Blame shift begins. Immediately, responsibility began to move. Field officers blamed conditions. Intelligence blamed outdated data. Command blamed unexpected resistance. The truth remained buried, because admitting it would mean admitting murder by order. Survivors are a problem. Those who lived posed a risk. They talked. They remembered. They asked questions, so they were reassigned, dispersed, silenced by time, trauma, and bureaucracy. No official debrief ever asked the real question, did you know you were being sacrificed? History gets edited. The battle would later be described as a costly engagement, a necessary diversion, a brave but difficult operation, never a massacre, never intentional, never planned. But the paperwork told a different story, and somewhere, in a forgotten archive, the truth waited. Realization doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, between explosions, between orders that make no sense, between the growing silence on the radio. For the men on the ground, understanding came too late to matter. The moment the lie breaks, it usually began with a pause. A soldier notices something off. No follow-up orders, no support, no response from command. Then someone says it out loud. They're not coming. Not reinforcements, not air cover, not extraction, no one. Patterns of abandonment. Soldiers are trained to look for patterns. And the pattern here was unmistakable. Requests ignored, coordinates repeated without reply, promises made and never fulfilled. This wasn't chaos. This was abandonment. Officers lose faith. Some officers stopped relaying orders, not out of rebellion, but because they could no longer justify them. Sending men forward meant certain death. Holding position meant slow annihilation. Either way, command had already accepted the outcome. Survival becomes the only order. Discipline eroded. Men fought in pairs instead of units. Shared ammunition, shared silence. Ranks stopped mattering. Only proximity did. The mission was no longer relevant. Living another minute was. Witnessing the unrecoverable bodies piled in places no one could reach. Wounded men lay calling for help that could not come. Some begged to be moved. Others begged for it to end. Medics made impossible decisions. Who might live, and who definitely would not. This is the part of war history rarely records, because it cannot be sanitized. Friendly fire isn't always accidental. In the confusion, artillery fell short. Strafing runs missed targets. Official reports later blamed fog of war. Survivors knew better. Command had marked the entire zone as expendable. The radio message that changed everything. One transmission broke through the noise, a fractured voice, barely controlled. "We are being sacrificed. Do you understand? We are being sacrificed." The reply never came. The channel went dead. When retreat is no longer ordered, some units pulled back anyway. Not as a maneuver, as an instinct. Those who made it out would later face investigations, not for failure, but for surviving. Because survival disrupted the narrative. Trauma without context. Survivors carried something worse than guilt. They carried knowledge that their friends hadn't died for a mistake, or bad luck, or enemy brilliance. They had died because someone decided they could be lost. That truth never leaves you. Silence after the guns. When the firing finally stopped, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Equipment scattered, weapons rusting in place, bodies unrecovered. The official order came days later. Area secured, operation concluded. Nothing about the cost. The men who came back. Different, those who returned were quieter, angrier, older. They stopped believing in briefings, stopped trusting medals, stopped saluting with conviction, because once you know the truth, you can never unknow it. Wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when the story is decided, and in this case, the story was chosen carefully. The first press release. Within days, official statements appeared. Words like valor, sacrifice, and necessary engagement filled the pages. There was no mention of abandoned units, no mention of ignored distress calls, no mention of casualty projections approved in advance. The massacre was reframed as bravery under fire. Controlled language, controlled memory. The wording mattered. High losses replaced devastation. Strategic withdrawal replaced collapse. Operational success replaced failure. Once the language changed, perception followed. This is how history is quietly rewritten. Medals instead of answers. Decorations were issued quickly. Posthumous awards, commendations for leadership, citations written by people who weren't there. Families received folded flags and formal letters. Many believed them because believing was easier than questioning. Families asked the wrong questions. Mothers asked if their sons were brave. Wives asked if their husbands suffered. Fathers asked if it was worth it. No one asked if it had been planned, and no one would have answered honestly if they did. Survivors are paraded, then discarded. A handful of survivors were interviewed. They were chosen carefully, briefed thoroughly, watched closely. Those who strayed from the approved narrative were edited out. After the cameras left, so did the support. The report that never circulated, an internal after-action report, painted a different picture. It mentioned predictable enemy response, insufficient support, unavoidable casualty levels. The report was classified, then buried, then forgotten. On purpose. Promotions still happen. Commanders involved didn't disappear. They advanced. New posts, new stars, new responsibilities. Failure on the battlefield became success on paper because the truth would have been inconvenient. Monuments without context. Years later, monuments were built. Names carved into stone, dates engraved, battles summarized in a single sentence. Visitors stood silently, unaware that those names were chosen for death long before they were chosen for memory. Stone never tells you that part. The lie settles in. With time, repetition hardens fiction into fact. Textbooks adopt the official version, documentaries echo it, teachers pass it on. Eventually, questioning it feels wrong, unpatriotic, disrespectful. That's when the lie is complete. But some things don't stay buried. Not everything cooperates. Paper degrades, witnesses age, guilt loosens tongues, and the truth, patient and stubborn, waits. Time is dangerous to lies because time weakens the people who protect them and strengthens the evidence they tried to bury. The first voice breaks the silence. It usually starts with one man, older now, tired, no longer afraid of consequences. He speaks at a reunion, or in a small local interview, or into a recorder meant only for family. And he says the sentence that wasn't supposed to exist. They knew what would happen. Dismissed as memory. At first, no one listens. He's called bitter, traumatized, confused. Memory is unreliable, they say. But memory has a way of aligning, especially when many people remember the same thing. More voices follow, another veteran speaks, then another. Different units, different locations, same story. Ignored warnings, no support, orders that made no tactical sense. Individually, they can be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern. The documents resurface archives, open slowly. Boxes mislabeled, folders misfiled. Reports never meant to be read again. A historian finds a memo. A journalist finds a casualty projection. A researcher notices dates that don't align. And suddenly, the official timeline starts to wobble. The phrase that changes everything. One document becomes impossible to ignore. A planning note written weeks before the operation. It includes expected losses, not estimated, expected. The number is horrifying, and it matches the final death toll almost exactly. Coincidence, they say. Officials respond carefully. They call it routine planning, standard procedure, misinterpretation, but the language betrays them. Because planning for heavy casualties is not the same as accepting them, and accepting them is not the same as designing around them. Families begin to ask different questions. Children grow up. They read. They research. They notice inconsistencies between official stories and survivor accounts. They start asking questions their parents never thought to ask. And suddenly, grief becomes anger. The institutional wall goes up. Requests for records are denied. Files remain sealed for national security. Interviews are canceled. Funding disappears. This reaction confirms what denial never could, because if nothing was wrong, there would be nothing to hide. Survivors pay the price. Some veterans who speak out lose pensions. Others face public criticism. A few are labeled traitors. They expected it. They speak anyway. Because at a certain age, truth matters more than protection, the word no one wants to use. Eventually, someone says it publicly. Massacre, not accident, not tragedy, not miscalculation. Massacre, planned, approved, executed. The reaction is immediate. History pushes back. Institutions resist fiercely. Admitting the truth would mean admitting intentional sacrifice, admitting political calculation, admitting crimes without enemies to blame. So the fight begins. Memory versus power. When the truth threatens power, justice becomes optional. And in this case, justice never stood a chance. The investigation that was never meant to succeed. Under public pressure, an inquiry is announced. Carefully worded, narrowly scoped, quietly delayed. Witnesses are limited. Documents are redacted. Key decision makers are declared unavailable. The investigation exists to exhaust outrage, not resolve it. Jurisdiction as a shield responsibility is blurred intentionally. Command says they followed political orders. Politicians say they relied on military expertise. Advisors claim they only provided information. Everyone touched the decision. No one owns it. Time is a weapon, years pass. Key figures retire. Some die. Others become untouchable symbols. Statutes of limitation expire. What once looked like a crime now looks like history, and history, they say, cannot be tried. Classified forever. The most damning files remain sealed, not for decades, indefinitely. The justification is always the same: national security. Even when the war is long over, even when the enemy no longer exists, because the real threat is not exposure, it's precedent. The danger of accountability. If this massacre is acknowledged, what about the others? What about every mission where losses were acceptable? One admission could unravel a century of sanitized warfare. So the line is held, at all costs, the scapegoat strategy. Sometimes one figure is offered up, a mid-level officer, a planner with limited authority, a man already disgraced. He takes the blame. The system survives. This is not justice. It's containment. Veterans watch in silence. Those who survive see the outcome clearly. No apology, no accountability, no truth, just memorials and speeches. Some stop speaking altogether. Others become obsessed with being heard. Neither ever fully escapes the knowledge. Schools teach the safe version. The event enters textbooks, brief, neutral, bloodless, a paragraph where there should be a chapter. Students memorize dates. They are never taught intent. Questioning becomes taboo. To challenge the narrative is framed as disrespectful. To ask hard questions is labeled political. To call it a massacre is called offensive. Silence becomes patriotic. The final shield. Complexity. Defenders hide behind complexity. War is complicated, they say. Decisions are difficult. Hindsight is unfair. But complexity does not erase responsibility. It only disguises it. No one is punished. Not because the truth is unclear, but because it is clear and unacceptable. So the file is closed. Again. Some burdens cannot be buried. No medal, no parade, no official statement can erase them. And for those who survived, the mission didn't end when they left the battlefield. Survivors who carried ghosts. They walked home. They slept. They laughed. And yet, always, something followed them. The faces of comrades, the echo of gunfire. The question, why was I allowed to live when they weren't? Some turned to alcohol, some to silence, some to obsession, recording, testifying, writing. Families that never knew letters arrived late. Bodies were misidentified. Stories were sugar-coated. Parents asked if their sons had been brave. Wives asked if their husbands had suffered. Children never knew the truth. And when whispers of what really happened reached them decades later, disbelief became grief all over again. Survivor testimonies. One veteran described it simply. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The ones we buried where no one could mark their graves. I hear the orders that never came. And I know. They knew we'd die. Another said, we weren't told we were expendable. We just became it. These voices, once ignored, refused to be silenced. PTSD, before the term existed. The psychological scars were immediate and permanent. Nightmares, startled responses, inability to trust, inability to forgive. Some men never left their homes again. Some walked the same paths their fallen comrades had died on, haunted by memory. History books called them brave. They called themselves survivors. Communities wounded. Entire towns lost young men in one day. Factories, farms, families, diminished, devastated. Funerals came in waves. The town square became a silent graveyard of unrealized potential. No explanation was given. No apology issued. The official narrative moved on. Art, literature, and memory artists, writers, and filmmakers began capturing fragments of the truth. They couldn't tell the story exactly. Censorship, politics, public discomfort. But the shadow of the massacre seeped into culture. Books with unnamed battles, paintings of faceless soldiers, poems of men walking into the inevitable. Truth survived in fragments. Survivors' last words. For those who lived to tell the tale, one thing became clear. It wasn't the enemy that destroyed us. It was the people who said we must go anyway. And the realization stayed with them until the end of their days. The lesson they carried. Some tried to teach the next generation, question orders, question authority. Remember that war is not just about strategy, it is about human lives. Because no lesson in history is complete if it ignores sacrifice that was deliberately chosen. Time has a way of exposing what was once hidden. Decades after the massacre, fragments began to surface. Declassified documents files, long sealed under national security, finally became accessible. Memos, maps, projected casualty lists. The words were stark. High probability of unit annihilation, acceptable losses. Suddenly, the evidence no longer needed interpretation. Historians piecing it together. A few brave historians began the painstaking work. They cross-referenced survivor testimonies, matched reports to archival footage, noted discrepancies in official publications. Patterns emerged, and the picture became undeniable. Survivor testimonies confirmed survivors' accounts, once dismissed as trauma-fueled memory, aligned perfectly with the documents. The orders ignored, the warnings dismissed. The human cost anticipated, not accidental. History could no longer be rewritten. Public awareness grows. Journalists picked up the story. Podcasts, books, documentaries emerged. The phrase planned sacrifice began appearing in print. Families began demanding answers. Politicians were forced to respond. The silence that once protected the guilty began to crack. Institutions resist. Yet institutions resisted fiercely. Official histories were amended slowly. Press releases framed the new findings cautiously. Terms like unforeseen and regrettable were still used to soften the truth. Even when truth emerges, power protects its image. Monuments reconsidered, some memorials were updated. Plaques now include language acknowledging intentional risk and loss. Historians debated ethics, responsibility, and accountability in classrooms. At last, those who died and those who survived had their stories closer to reality. The uncomfortable lesson history finally spoke. Not because the guilty confessed, not because justice was served, but because evidence cannot remain hidden forever. The lesson was clear. Human lives are never expendable unless those in power decide they are. Legacy of the survivors once ignored now hold a voice. They speak at ceremonies. They lecture at universities. They ensure the next generation knows we were told to die. History tried to forget, but we survived to tell the truth. Time passes. Generations are born and die, but some memories refuse to fade. This mission, the one planned for death, continues to echo. The weight of truth. Even now, decades later, historians, survivors, and families struggle with the same question. How could it have been allowed? Not just a mistake, not just the fog of war, but deliberate. The moral weight is immense. Lessons for the living war is often framed as glory, honor, and duty. But beneath the medals, speeches, and textbooks, the truth is darker. Men were chosen. Men were told nothing. Men were sent to die, and history was written to forget. Survivors as witnesses. Those who lived carry stories that cannot be archived. The fear, the despair, the quiet courage of those who refused to panic while the world abandoned them. Every survivor is a living memorial. Families who remember children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, all inherit the memory. Even when official records deny it, personal histories resist erasure. They whisper the truth in kitchens, living rooms, and classrooms. They knew institutions, ethics, and reflection. Modern military ethics now examine these missions closely. Risk assessments, accountability structures, and transparency measures are intended to prevent repetition. But the past reminds us, bureaucracies often value obedience over life, and when life becomes expendable, history will remember, even if the present tries not to. The haunting of memory. Every battlefield leaves ghosts, some visible, some invisible. This mission haunts in silence, in archived reports, in letters never sent, in names etched on stone. The question persists, who decides that a human life is an acceptable loss? And the answer is terrifying. Closing reflection. We tell this story not to condemn one army, one leader, or one era. We tell it to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that the lesson is not repeated. Because when orders are followed without question, when sacrifice is accepted as inevitable, when history is rewritten for convenience, the cost is not abstract. It is human, and it cannot be forgotten. The screen fades to black. Silence. A final caption appears, for those who knew, and for those who were never given a choice. History has a way of hiding the truths we most need to remember. Some missions were never meant to succeed. Some lives were never meant to be saved. But remembering is a choice. Bearing witness is our responsibility. Because if we forget, history may repeat itself. We cannot change the past, but we can honor it. We can listen. We can learn. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect, share, and discuss. Subscribe to this channel for more untold histories and join us as we uncover the dark truths that shaped our world. Because every story deserves to be remembered. Remember them. Question everything. Never forget.